series has been about, and what we've wanted to accomplish here is bringing down the giants in our lives, being able to take them down. You know, I asked you at the very beginning of this series to do something different. For those of us that were raised in the church, and we've heard that story of David and Goliath so many times, and so many times, every time when we picture ourselves in that story, we put ourselves in David's place, that we're the one fighting David. And I ask you to do something different. Instead of putting yourself as David, put Jesus as David. That he's the one who fights the battles. That he's the giant slayer. Now, the giants that we face in our lives, they're defeated, but they still have some life left in them. They've convinced us that we're small, that they're invincible, and there's nothing we can do. You know, and then the next thing we did after I asked you to put Jesus in the place of David there, we started looking at some of the most common giants that we have in our lives. Fear, rejection, comfort or complacency, and how we bring them down. And today we're going to talk about another giant, one that is no stranger to any one of us, and that's anger. Anger. I don't know if God does this, but it's kind of like when you buy a car, you didn't realize so many other people had a car like yours, and you start being more observant of things. But it seems like God puts in the way, at least in mine, and I know guys that's doing communion meditations, they'll say that, that they noticed something that week leading up, and it helped them with knowing what to say. But this week, it just seemed like that everywhere I turned, there was somebody that was right on the edge of anger taking control. I don't know, it happened 3 or 4 times this week. I went in to visit somebody or whatever, and they say, man, I can't believe you showed up. This must be a God thing because I needed you right now because I'm about to explode. Or it's a God thing, and they'd say, I'm so glad you're here. And they would talk about something that was about ready to push them over the edge. Now, I went back and visited back in my hometown this week, so of course that was all people there. We know no one here gets angry and about to explode. That's all those people back there that was happening with. But it's just that we're right on the edge so many times. If you ask people, are you an angry person? The overwhelming majority of people would say, no, I don't bite people's heads off. I don't fly off the handle. I'm not throwing stuff across the room. But just under the surface, just out of the sight of the people around us, is there a little fire simmering? Is there anger just simmering there, waiting for the right conditions to break into a flame? We've all seen hot coals in a fireplace or in a campfire, and it's not really a fire, but if you just put some air to them, or they get just the right condition, they burst into flames. Firemen will tell you that a fire can smolder inside the walls of a house for hours before it breaks out into a fire. Or a wire can get hot and burn many, many times before it bursts into a flame. And that's really how it works in our life, the same for us, isn't it? We go along and we go along and we go along, and underneath the surface there's a simmering fire, but there's no flames. But then finally something happens and we have a fire. Anger engulfs us. Eric a few weeks ago talked about the giant of rejection. So much of what makes us angry is rejection. Have you ever thought about that? It's born in rejection. Is that me? I think it's me. So much of what makes us angry is born in rejection. If you think about it, we get angry because someone rejects us or they reject an idea. It's something they did or didn't do that makes us angry. And all of us have areas in our lives that causes friction. That, maybe for you it's parenting. Maybe it's parenting that causes the friction in your life. Maybe it's marriage, that you don't feel like your spouse respects you or listens to you. Maybe it's your job and you don't feel like that they appreciate your contributions or you're not being treated fairly. And sometimes we're just angry at God. We're angry at life because of the way life has turned out or direction that it's taken. You see, there are a million things that can make us angry. That's why this is a giant that we must bring down, because we're never going to remove all of the things that can make us angry. They're always going to be there. So it's a giant that we must bring down. Anger in itself is not wrong, but if anger is uncontrolled, it is a giant of a problem. Ephesians 4:26 and 27 says this, "In your anger do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you're still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold." You see, anger must be controlled, even in the simmer stage, or you see what happens. James said this in James 1:19. "My dear brothers, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry." That is some of the best advice you'll ever get in your entire life. Is that right there? Jesus got angry. He even expressed anger. But don't use that as an excuse for your anger. Let's face it. Jesus knew how to handle anger. And maybe you can too. Maybe you're good enough at getting angry at the right time, with the right measure, with the right response, about the right things, and bringing about the right outcome. Simple, right? So before you make the excuse that Jesus got angry, maybe we need to spend some time learning how he handled it and how many of his great servants handled it. So that's what I want to focus on today, is handling that anger in our life. In the story of David and Goliath, you don't see David very angry. Now, I'm sure he was angry at Goliath because of him blaspheming the name of God. They had a righteous anger. But you do see David surrounded by a great deal of anger. I want to go back to the Old Testament, the story of David and Goliath. 1 Samuel 17, verses 26 and 28, it says this. David asked the men standing near him, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" Then down to verse 28. When Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him and asked, "Why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the desert? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle." Eric mentioned a couple of weeks ago in talking about rejection, he talked about Eliab. Now, why would Eliab react this way? David had done nothing wrong. Nothing wrong. But Eliab felt slighted. He felt rejected and overlooked. And because he didn't deal with his emotions, it turned to anger. And he turned against his brother. And you notice all this in the key information in verse 28. It says he burned with anger. That's a sin. He judged David's heart. That's a sin. He reframed David in his image instead of God's. That's a sin. He belittled David in what he does for a living. That's a sin. Sound like anything we do when we get angry at somebody? Do we do one or two or all of these things? Even if it's just a simmering fire, do we do these things? That's why this is such a dangerous giant, because it affects relationships with others and with God, because sin is involved. Look back at the beginning of the problem. The problem, just to recap that again, Samuel has been sent by God to anoint a new king to take Saul's place, because he is very displeasing to God. And he sends him to Jesse's house, his family. And he says, "I want to see your sons." And he marches out the sons to choose which one would be the king. Of course, with the precedent of that day, they start with the oldest son. Eliab is the oldest, and this is what happens. 1 Samuel 16:7 says this. "But the Lord said to Samuel, do not," and this is when Eliab is out there, he says, "Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things man looks at. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Eliab chose. Now, you got to know that word. Eliab chose to trust his own judgment more than the judgment of God. Eliab chose to compare and compete with David instead of celebrating and affirming David. And the fire was lit. But there's something to learn about anger here as well. It's not just that when we get angry, but how do we handle it when people around us are angry? I've told this story. It was some years ago, but it's such a great story. I've got to tell it again. A lady that I grew up going to church with, Goldie Belcher. That's a name, isn't it? Goldie Belcher. She's a good friend of my mom's. One day, she was walking up to, there was Kmart and Winn-Dixie in the same little shopping center there. And as she was walking up to this, she looked and saw a woman had another woman down right off the sidewalk in the parking lot, had her down, it was choking her in the parking lot. And Goldie Belcher is about this big. She is not an imposing woman. But Goldie walked up to the woman and just put her hand on her shoulder and she says, "Honey, you don't want to do this." And the woman let go of the other woman. And Goldie took her and they just walked away and they talked. What do we do when other people are angry? Now, that's a great thing we learned from David here. David didn't let his brother's anger stop him. 1 Samuel 17, verses 29 through 31. David says this. He says, "Now what have I done?" said David. "Can I even speak?" He then turned away to someone else and brought up the same matter, and the men answered him as before. What David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. David kept going, even though his brother was angry at him. And he won a tremendous battle that benefited all of Israel, his brothers included. And that's such a great lesson for us here. Don't let the anger of another person cause us to fail, cause us to quit, cause us to sin. It's not just about how we handle our anger, it's how we handle the anger around us. Now, every minister, when he's preparing a message, he wants it to be memorable. He wants it to something to become out of that a person carries with them. Now, I don't care if you carry nothing else from today, this one statement, take it home with you. We believe what God did for us is greater than what anyone could do against us. We believe that what God did for us is greater than what anyone could do against us. And when we take that and we believe that and we say, I'm going to live that, it changes your life. How do we apply this then to an everyday life? How do we make it a part of the process of our lives? You know, David carried 5 smooth stones, it says, into battle. And there's a lot of theories why he picked up 5 stones. But whatever the theory is, I want to give you 5 things, 5 stones you can carry with you into everyday life here. Very quickly, 5 things here. And the first one's this: we are not perfect. I am not perfect. You know, and intellectually, we acknowledge that. We'll say, well, yeah, nobody's perfect. But when someone wrongs us, and we feel justified to be angry, we forget that. They deserve my anger. They deserve my wrath. The word wrath is used 197 times in the New International Version translated. Have you ever made God angry? Have you ever caused God to be angry by your behavior? Has your imperfections caused God to be angry? Well, the answer is yes and no. Yes, we understand our anger. We understand anger in our terms. It's out of control. It's unreasonable. But God's wrath or God's anger is justified. It is under control. God's wrath or anger is better defined as righteous indignation caused by injustice or sin. Ephesians 2:3 says this, all of us also lived among them at one time. It's talking about living outside of Christ, gratifying the cravings of our sinful nature and following its desires and thoughts. Like the rest, we were by nature objects of, what's the word? Wrath. We were objects of wrath. You know, another thing that I'm going to say the rest of the way through this time, through this message here, is we've got to see life through the cross. We've got to see life through the cross, one side of the cross to the other. God, by his nature, hates sin, and he must hold sinners accountable. On this side of the cross, we are at the mercy of God's wrath, that righteous indignation because of sin and injustice. But on the other side of the cross, after what happened on the cross, sin has been dealt with. The wrath of God has been dealt with. We no longer owe a debt to satisfy God's wrath. 1 Thessalonians 5:9 says this, for God did not appoint us to suffer wrath, but to receive salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ. If we will only stop with that one smooth stone when we're about to get angry, and just remember that, nobody's perfect. And I was imperfect before God, and he forgave my sins. Maybe we won't be so quick to turn loose of our wrath on other people. Second one is this. The second stone to carry with you is this. We have received peace. Once again, look at the cross. God has always loved us, but we have not always been at peace with God. We've been separated from God because of sin. Have you ever been at odds with somebody? Somebody that you got to see on a daily basis? You know how uncomfortable that is, to be at odds in your family, for things not to be going well. And then if you kind of make up and you smooth it over, but there's that one person who stirs it up again. You've got people like that in your life, in your family, don't you? About the time you get everything peaceful, they stir it back up again. Anger does that. We have been brought to peace, but anger stirs up trouble in our relationships. It's in our hearts. Don't let anger back in to mess up things again. Jesus is described by many, many names. Wonderful Counselor, Prince of Peace, and one place we're told he is our peace. If we can remember that we have received peace, he is our peace, maybe we won't be so quick to turn loose of anger. Stone number three, we have an avenger. We have an avenger. You know, we become angry because we have believed we have been mistreated unjustly. We're created in the image of God. And because of that, we crave justice, because God craves justice. Our problem is we do a very poor job of administering justice. Jesus says, leave it to me. I'll do a much better job. We crave justice. God craves justice. But we do such a bad job with it. And Jesus says, let me do it. Leave it to me. That's why even when we have a right to be angry, when we have a right to seek justice, we have to be so careful, so very careful. Most of the time, our expressions of anger and our attempts at punishment in this life are like throwing gasoline on a fire. Can we go back to the cross again? Anything that needs avenging, let this sink in. Anything that needs avenging, Jesus is either already taken care of at the cross or he will take care of in the end. That's why he says this in Romans 12:17. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everybody. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, my friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. Now, before that just kind of goes away from you, let this sink in. You know who said that? Paul. Paul was unjustly imprisoned on multiple occasions. It says he was beaten with rods 3 times. He was whipped within an inch of his life 5 times. He was stoned and left for dead. Anybody top that one? Anybody? Yeah, me either. But Paul says, leave it to God. Leave those things to God. 4th stone, we forgive. We forgive. Ephesians 4:25-27. Now, I've already read that once, but I want to add a verse to it. It says, therefore each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to his neighbor, for you are all members of one body. That's the part I want you to get there. In your anger do not sin. We've already read this. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold. You may have noticed that I said our smooth stone here is we forgive, but these verses mention nothing about forgiveness. But what usually makes us angry? People. People make us angry. And he says we're all part of the same brotherhood. We're all part of the same body. It's usually something that people did or something that they didn't do, something they said or didn't say. And Paul here says, deal with that anger quickly and decisively. Don't let it simmer. Don't let it come to a boil. Don't let it eventually turn into a fire. Forgive people and move on. Move on. Enjoy the peace that God has already brought to you. Can you go back to the cross again? Remember, I said we can't get away from the cross here. What happened there? Is there anyone who thinks that they've done enough good in their life, that they can do enough good in their life, that they can stand before God and say, you don't need to forgive me, I've done enough good to make up for what I did wrong? Does anybody think they've got that much good? Didn't think so. And God knows that. And we've got to learn to live that way, that we forgive because we have been forgiven. Final stone here. We are different. We are different. Back to the cross. Because of what happened at the cross, and we live on the other side of the cross now, because we have accepted Jesus Christ. We have taken hold of his sacrifice for us. We are to be different. We are not just forgiven, we are to be different. We are now sons and daughters of God. We are to live a different life. We have a different expectation upon us that we didn't have before the cross. Philippians 2:14-15 says this, do everything without complaining or arguing. Paul's in a section here where he's talking about how he needs us to live a great life. And he goes on to verse 15, he says, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a crooked and depraved generation. He wrote this a couple of thousand years ago. It wasn't last week, but it sure sounds like it, doesn't it? In a crooked and depraved generation in which you shine like stars in the universe. What a thought. That we're to shine like stars in the universe. We are to be different. We are to stand out in a very good way. We live in a very angry world. We are surrounded by people who their lives are just a simmering fire. And they're ready to erupt at any moment. And they're glad to erupt. We live in that kind of world. And we cannot get caught up in that. That is not how God has called us to live. There are many things that a Christian can do to represent Jesus Christ in this world. And how we handle anger is right at the top. How people see us handle anger is at the top of the list. James 1:20 says this, "For man's anger does not bring about the righteous life that God desires." And we're heading towards our time of invitation. And I just got to ask the question. Just asking the question. Is your life just below the surface a simmering fire? Maybe no one ever sees the anger that is in your life. Or maybe people see your anger every day and they walk around in fear because of it. But I think there's more of us that the anger is right underneath. And whether it's because of the actions of another person or it's regret of our own actions, there's an anger there. There's a resentment, a bitterness that's just smoldering underneath. Let me ask you something. Are you tired of living like that? Are you tired of dealing with that just right there? And it's controlling you. If you are, you got to go back to the cross. You got to go back to what happened at the cross. And that changes everything because we believe that what God did for us is greater than anything someone could do against us. And that will change how you live. That will change everything.